Welcome to ARC's Supernova 2023. Tonight's 4 roundtable discussions feature our outstanding scholars in interactive conversations with distinguished moderators. While these scholars are not necessarily experts on these roundtable subjects, they come from a variety of scientific fields, and each one has conducted thoughtful research on these topics in preparation for tonight. Following the discussion, there will be time for Q&A. After the roundtable, please visit the scholars' posters, which are displayed all around the University Club. These posters are a fascinating sketch of each scholar's field of study. Now, thank you for joining the ARC's Roundtable on Climate Sustainability, Emerging Sciences. Please welcome our moderators, Jean-Pierre Delplanque, Vice Provost for Graduate Education and Dean of Graduate Studies, UC Davis. Jenny Sukali, Assistant Professor of Geophysics, Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. And our scholar panelists, Jackie Galvez, Integrative Biology, UC Berkeley. Carolyn SCHWARTZ, Integrative Biology, San Francisco State University. And Chase Stevens, Pharmacology and Toxicology, UC Davis.
Welcome to the Roundtable on Climate and Sustainability, Emerging Sciences. My name is Jean-Pierre Delplanque. I serve as Vice Provost and Dean of Graduate Studies at the University of California, Davis, and I'm also a Professor of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. I will be co-moderating the panel with...
Again, my name is Jenny Sukali. I'm a professor at Stanford. I'm in geophysics, environmental engineering, and computational and mathematical engineering. I'm a theoretical physicist by background, and now I apply that kind of approach to better understand nature's mean streak. So we work on disasters, volcanoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, landslides, all of the mean streak stuff. And then we try to leverage that knowledge to reduce the risk that these disasters pose. And with that, I'll hand it over to our beautiful and amazing young scientists who will introduce their research briefly to you to start the conversation.
I can go first. Hello, my name is Jackie Galvez. I am a 4th-year PhD student at UC Berkeley. I'm in Jack Sang's lab, also known as the Functional Anatomy and Vertebrate Evolution Laboratory. I'm a member of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley, and all this to say is that I am a fish enthusiast or an ichthyologist. That's a fancy name for a fish biologist. I am a functional morphologist, which means that I study the anatomical and physical structures of organisms to understand how they move in their environments and what this means for evolution. Specifically, I study steelhead and rainbow trout. Do I have any fishers in the room who may be familiar with these at all? Yeah, I get some nods. All right, great. So I specifically study dam-impacted populations of steelhead trout, and specifically how dams can influence the body shape changes in these organisms. So I have a poster with some of my preliminary findings out there in the poster hall. I'd be happy to talk more about it, but basically I'm just interested in human-mediated impacts on evolutionary biology and what this means for our native fish populations.
Perfect. Thank you, Jackie. My name is Carolyn SCHWARTZ. I am a 2nd-year master's student at San Francisco State University in the Velez Lab. My PI is actually here in the audience. In our lab, we study sensory systems, particularly communication systems. The communication system we work with in our lab is the Pacific Chorus Frog communication system, which is the stereotypical ribbit that you hear in movies. They're all over the Bay Area as well as in California, so you probably have heard them around. What my research particularly focuses on is how environmental stressors impact the communication system. And this big project we're working on now particularly examines how anthropogenic noise or human-generated noise impacts that communication system. I primarily focus on characterizing how this type of noise, being novel and very loud, impacts the acoustic environment or all the sounds found within an ecosystem. So I'm looking at characterizing that. And I also look at how this stressor could possibly affect hearing in the frogs, which is super important for communication, because if a frog can't hear, a frog can't respond. So yeah, that is my research.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chase Stevens. I'm a fifth-year pharmacology and toxicology grad student at UC Davis, and I'm in the Fiend Lab at UC Davis, but also collaborate with the Van Winkle and Pinkerton labs on campus. And my research aims to help asthmatic populations who don't currently respond to available therapies. Specifically, I'm interested in the effects of ozone exposure in worsening characteristics of asthma, looking at lipids within the lung and how changes in lipid composition can exacerbate characteristics of asthma. So using mass spectrometry imaging and metabolomics, we're not only able to see the overall changes in lung lipids, but where these changes are occurring, and we can also identify biomarkers and novel therapeutic targets for future therapeutic development in asthma.
Thank you. So we figured that it would be good to have this be a conversation and engaging the audience with questions and see which of the panelists can address it, maybe all of them at the same time. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate either to start asking that question, raise your hand if there is too many, so that we can start the conversation going. Is there anything that prompted you in what you heard about our panelists' research that prompted a question for you? Yes?
Are there emerging technologies that can really let us... Are there emerging technologies that can really help us define what the characteristics of our environment, our acoustical environment, or the temperature environment, or I just wonder what is out there that's innovative to address climate issues and just defining what the climate is.
Thank you.
So I can start with that a little bit. So as far as technologies that are coming out, specifically in my field, bioacoustic monitoring is pretty new. It's something that I'm starting to do, and it's essentially something very, very simple where you put out a recorder. It's an automated recording device. It allows you to take these recordings, then you can analyze them later, and it's pretty new, and our study is one of the first studies to look at actually characterizing the environment so we can kind of know where our climate is at as far as how our noise levels are changing goes. Besides that, there could be more things out there. I don't know if any other panelists know of anything.
Perhaps I could just follow up as a very layman question on that. In terms of trying to understand the baseline of, you're able to monitor current sound that with this significant anthropogenic noise, and you're looking at changes, but I'm trying to think how you get at the baseline of which changes have occurred correlated with sound, as human sound, as opposed to other kind of, maybe other human pressures, but other evolutionary pressures.
So that's a really good question. In my study, to kind of expand a little bit more on what I provided initially, we have chosen sites, and other studies before ours have chosen sites based on overall basic characterizations. So when we started our project, we looked at finding sites that are in more rural areas. So something that is pretty far away from the road, there's not a lot of human activity there, where they'd more likely experience things like other vocalizations, wind, and other things that have been around for a while. We've also chosen study sites that have looked at high natural noise, in a sense, where we choose, we have two sites particularly that are coastal, so there's a lot of very loud, consistent wave noise, stuff like that. And then we choose sites, obviously, with a lot of high anthropogenic noise. So, we have a site at San Francisco Airport, a site in the Presidio right in the city, and we're able to kind of, if we see changes between those populations, we're able to kind of say, okay, there's a difference between this high natural noise site and this high anthropogenic noise site, as opposed to maybe the rural sites, if that makes sense.
Jackie, I think you were going to weigh in on the sensor question.
Yes. So my lab and I mainly study sort of the downstream effects of human change upon our environment. So I have lab mates that are in biomechanics and using like a lot of physics concepts in that sense. So once we sort of identify the broad-ranging ways in which we are increasing climate change and damaging our environment, a big question becomes, what are the ways that we're affecting these populations? And so in functional morphology, one of the emerging technologies is CT scanning to make 3D models. And so what you can do is that if you have a question, so for instance, my questions are really weighing the differences between above and below dam fish. I can take the fish. They do have to be, preserved as specimens. So I go out to the field, do some collections, and then you put them in a CT scanner, and that gives you very fine scale understanding of the internal structures of the organisms, things that you may not be able to capture should you, just take photos of the fish, which typically was done prior to this emerging technology. And this is a very versatile way that lots of morphologists are learning about structures that are internal to organisms, specifically very small organisms. My juvenile steelhead are only about this big, so it's difficult to do dissections on such a tiny fish. And so with CT scanning, we can really understand what's going on in terms of the musculoskeletal structure. Another emerging technology, at least in the biomechanics and functional morphology field, is actually, we call it the Mark 10, and it's a way to basically impose physical strain and pressure on 3D printed models or other things in order to sort of understand where the pressure points are and when these things actually break. So one of my lab mates is an undergraduate in my lab. She is crushing a bunch of 3D printed shells right now. It's for a similar kind of tracking climate variation and what that means for shells. So there are a lot of different things that are emerging to sort of study the downstream effects of climate once we identify the broad-reaching patterns that may lead to interesting questions, and we can help answer how organisms are being affected.
Can you give us an example of something that's changed on your micro-CT scan?
Yeah, definitely. So I personally, in my system, I've noticed that the body shape of above and below dam steelhead is different. So above dam steelhead have larger heads and bigger eyes, where below dam steelhead have a more torpedo-shaped or streamlined body, which is better for swimming. So what the dam may be doing is it might be enacting a barrier between the two populations, which doesn't allow for as clean kind of population mixing. And basically that means that the above dam fish can evolve to be slightly different than the below dam fish, possibly worse swimmers. And I've done this with physical photos of the fish specimens, as well as looking at their CT scans. And what the CT scanning really gives me is sort of the skeletal structure within and how the orbit of the eye as well as the skull is changing versus the overall body shape. So it's sort of an additional layer that I've included along with photos of the specimens themselves.
So are you actually dividing into two pseudo-species there?
That's a good question. So the word and concept of species is very nebulous and broad, so I don't think at this point we can consider them two different species. There would have to be a lot of things that you'd have to sort of prove to show that they're, unable to mix as a single population. But we can definitely say that there is some local adaptation going on, or if not local adaptation, at least the dam is basically enacting a barrier that will prevent them from sort of being exposed to the exact same evolutionary selection pressures. Yeah. Thanks so much for your question.
Hi. I noticed that each of your guys' projects has, you seem to be in the characterizing portion of its effect on climate change and things like that, and I'm very familiar with how long these processes take, especially amongst scientific projects. But I'd love to hear your guys' 10-year plan. Say if you're able to characterize all the different sound effects and the differences on environmental fish development and things like that, how would you then want to go on and change it or alter it like your big 10-year plan. I think it would just be really cool to hear that.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Do you mean like 10-year plan of like, per se, like in my project, like mitigation method, or if I were to further the study, like what I would look at later on?
I think more, especially because you guys have already been like collecting data, based off what you've collected so far and characterized so far, where would you see yourself taking this project as in a sense of actually combating these climate changes and environmental impacts if you were to try to alter them? If that makes more sense. Did that make it worse?
I'll answer and hopefully it covers everything. Okay. I think with my project specifically looking at human-generated noise, it's really difficult to think of mitigation methods that are applicable in society. Obviously, I would love for everything to decrease if there are effects. Outside of my study, a lot of studies have looked into negative effects that this noise has had on a variety of animal behaviors, not limited to communication, but other things like foraging as well. And I always have a tough time with this question because I've read papers about how we could put this sound barrier up here next to maybe like there's an airport right next to a special listed species population. But we have pros and cons with everything similar to like barriers. It could help. However, it could impact other species that are maybe trying to move in the area, or it could be made of a material that might degrade over time or might be harmful to the environment if we're looking at biomethods. I guess where I would go with this is starting to look at things that we can maybe engineer, specifically with my study. It's a lot of work and it's probably way in the future, way in 10 years, but maybe designing specifically when looking at anthropogenic noise, vehicle noise in general, airplanes, cars, etc., being able to minimize the noise that comes off of those vehicles, or maybe making it a higher pitch where most animals can't even hear it, that sort of thing.
I think you all get to answer this one.
Yeah. Do you want to go? Should I go? Sure. Yeah, go for it.
So in terms of my research direction and potential further research, I'd like to incorporate single-cell RNA sequencing and really combine the power of these emerging omics technologies to really understand what individual cells are doing within the lung in response to many of these air pollutants, not only with ozone, but also emerging air pollutants such as wildfire smoke, to really understand what happens at the single cell level, because I think this is key to our understanding of how different diseases may originate and how these cells may communicate with one another to elicit disease.
I really love this question because I spend most of my time thinking about how dams are very stressful and how they impact a lot of the native habitats of the fish and river systems I love a lot. But we also know that dams are very useful because hydroelectricity is a big way that we as humans are able to live the lives that we are used to. And so a lot of my research and what I think about in terms of sustainability, and this is less about climate change specifically because dams on their own don't really impact climate change or vice versa. But yeah, just sort of weighing human need with environmental conservation. And something that I would love to see in the field in the next 10 years is more studies that sort of isolate the systems in which dams are having the most negative impact on our fish populations. So one of these systems is the Klamath River system. And if you are privy to any sort of like environmental news outlets, you may have heard that recently there was approval to remove the 2 dams damming the Klamath. And I think that's a wonderful step in the right direction. These dams do provide hydroelectricity, so there will be a need to sort of mitigate the loss of power that comes with that. But doing studies that basically show the ways in which organisms' physical bodies are changing and what the detriments this may have on their swimming ability will allow us to identify the systems that are in need of most help. And I think that applies to a lot of different things when it comes to environmental sustainability in science, specifically at the organismal biology level, when we're really focused on the impacts on specific species versus like wide-scale habitat. So I think about it a lot. I would love to be involved in those efforts. I'm trying to personally make inroads for my career related to like California Fish and Wildlife and do all those kinds of things. So if you'd love to chat about that, I'll be available after. But thanks so much for the question.
To briefly follow up on that, there's also really exciting research now that tries to think more deeply about combining human and natural needs. So for example, for dams, there might be ways to include an outlet that allows for fish passage during certain times of years and for sediment transport, while also being able to close for flood protection. So I think that's a big frontier in the space of sustainability, is to not only think about human needs, but try to think about multiple different functionalities that we can achieve jointly. Other questions for our panelists?
All of you are so smart. I'm overwhelmed. But I have a question about, and I'd love a comment about the politicization of climate change, and how with some groups they say, oh, climate change, it's happened for hundreds of years and it's not really anything new. What does that impact your work at the level of your work and your research? And what do you say to that that group?
Let me maybe start and I'll pass it on to the panelists. My group works a lot with decision makers. It is one of the, I think, important aspects of the work that I'm passionate about. I spent a couple of years working for the United Nations in international disaster management, and it's important for me to connect the science we do with the societal benefits that we hope to achieve. The way we approach it is often to avoid the labeling and the divergence that comes from having that debate, right? Like, we're seeing changes. We can call it climate change. We can just call it changes. Let's just fix the problems that these changes entail. So, for example, we've seen a lot of flooding this year, and I think for some communities it's taken them by surprise because the last couple of years were more on the dry side, and so they felt like, oh, maybe California's getting drier. We see in the data California is just getting more extreme in both directions. And so let's think about what are those changes? How are they going to impact our lives? How are they going to impact what we value in terms of ecosystem health, in terms of our own health, in terms of community well-being? Let's try to fix the problems without attaching a label and whose fault it is. But I would love to hear from all of you.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar point on data. I think these are conversations that I've had with members of my own family, not in a heated debate sort of way, just sort of trying to understand what it is that I'm studying and what this buzzword of like global warming and climate change really means. But I find that providing data really goes a long way, especially it's most people, I find, when I talk about science and environmental health to them, they want to see the Earth healthy. And so showing data that alludes to possibly, changes in that health and how the health is, maybe decreasing, really motivates people to want to
make differences. And if there are ways that I can say, well, you can do X, Y, Z, or you can donate to these causes or make these small changes, usually that's a lot more effective than a sort of like a waving your finger and scolding people. And I found that to be most effective with members of my own family who really, before I started getting into biology and studying these things, didn't really understand a lot about human impacts on the environment and the ways that we do have a really big blueprint, footprint, but it doesn't have to be for bad. It can be for good.
I'm going to take this on a little tangent. I'm not going to try to go too far with it, but kind of going along with communicating in general. One of my biggest things when talking to people about climate sustainability, that topic as a whole, climate change, any sort of thing that has to do with climate change, is that I have trouble talking to people about it because I still feel like there's a really big disconnect between science and the general population that is not scientists. And I even find it as a scientist myself, I'll sometimes read papers per se about climate change, and I'll go through the paper once and I'll go, I don't know what I just read. And then I'll read it again and again and again. And with the knowledge I have and the background I have, I'm able to kind of piece the puzzle together. But on the topic of climate change, that's something I have a very hard time with talking to people about, specifically if they're on the side of it doesn't exist or it's been happening for hundreds of years, we're fine. It's kind of hard to find that middle ground of me being a scientist and me being like, well, here's all this data I can show you, but like showing them that data might not mean anything. So off of my tangent with that, I try to just, with that sort of conversation, kind of similar over here, just like how can we fix the problems that we see currently? And how can we fix the problems you might not have thought about before, specifically when it comes to climate change? Because I think that most people, when they think of climate change, they think of like generalized like greenhouse gases, emissions, like that kind of thing, when it's a very broad picture entailing a lot of things.
Similar to Jackie, whenever I'm explaining climate sustainability to my parents or other groups, one thing I really try to stress is that climate collectively affects all of us. It doesn't pick sides. So I think it's important for us to understand that and to come together and be willing to work with others to develop these solutions. So that's one of the main points that I try to stress in those conversations.
When you are thinking about all of this data you're generating that is really forming a foundation for a better understanding of the world, do you think at all about AI as something that's going to become a part of what you do?
I mean, I can go. I already know that AI is kind of involved in a lot of research or similar research to what I do. There's things out there like machine learning where you essentially, don't quote me on this, I'm not super well versed in machine learning, but you're essentially coding for something to learn for you. But I think AI could come in handy a lot with specifically the data processing end. Besides that, I mean, I'm not really well versed in AI. I don't use it myself, but.
So one of the things that I think we need to think carefully about AI is the biases that it imparts into our analysis. We've been struggling with that a bit. As I said, we do a lot of community engaged work, and there is data on some aspects of the problem and some aspects not so much. For example, we've started working or thinking about the impact of air pollution on communities in the Central Valley. It turns out tribal land has no sensors whatsoever. AI can't fix that problem. It will only look at the data that there is. So, for example, there's a bias right there, right? Like, so are we forgetting about the tribal communities in the Central Valley who are feeling those impacts very acutely? So I think AI AI it's a tool, and as all science tools, I think it has an important role to play. But I think it doesn't replace a scientific mind, right? Like, we still need to think critically about the questions we ask, about the problems. We need to talk to people. We need to hear their concerns. AI can be a powerful method, but it can also put on a blindfold that might be difficult to remove later. So like all scientific methods, it comes with its challenges and with its advantages, but it's no magic answer to climate.
Yeah, if I can add also something that we lose with machine learning, for instance, if we use only that tool, is the insight that more analytical model will provide. And so you get the benefit of the data analysis expedited, but you don't get the insight. It's a black box, right? So it doesn't help you explain what's going on, and both are needed.
It's okay. I can speak up.
No, we need the microphone. People online can't hear without.
Good evening. I applaud your efforts in scientific research, but it seems to me that one of the major problems, and I don't know whether it's quantified exactly, is forest fires. And so little is done about managing forests, especially in California. And to me, the air pollution and the bad effects of fires all around the world are as significant as perhaps power plants fueled by natural gas or whatever.
Could you please clarify your question? Sorry.
I guess my question is, there's something staring us all in the face which doesn't require a lot of scientific effort in the labs, and that is the danger of forest fires that we've experienced, especially in California, but it's in lots of other places. There was in Spain too. There was a number of things, and I'm just wondering how that compares to what you're trying to find out about climate change.
It's a little bit out of my area of expertise, but I can attempt to answer it. There are some emerging studies with trying to better manage forests, but at least in terms of my work better trying to understand the human health effects of these air pollutants. Mass spectrometry imaging are one of the techniques that I'm most interested in. Currently I'm studying ozone pollution from vehicle exhaust, but this technique can also be expanded to better understand the effects of wildfire particulate pollution within the lung and how that affects the rest of the body. But in terms of other mitigation strategies, and I'm not quite as familiar with those.
I'm happy to weigh in. So first of all, I think science has a huge role to play in that. And thanks for the question. I do agree that forest fires are one of the big challenges staring us in the face. Just to provide one example of what science can add to this, there's an amazing research project out of UC Berkeley, the Tree Mortality Project, which has looked at what was the prevalence of wildfires prior to forest management and fire suppression. And it turns out that California is a fire-prone landscape, and the ecosystems in California actually need the fires to thrive and survive. So this project has found that the devastating fire season in 2019 was actually quite representative of what historically has happened in California. So first of all, I think that's important to just acknowledge that fires are part of the extremes that California provides. Again, it's part of California's mean streak. what to do about it and how to approach that going forward, there's no doubt that climate change has a big impact on fires, particularly the speed at which fires propagate. That's been a huge challenge in the last couple of years. It's just they're super rapid, which also poses a severe risk for firefighters. So that's definitely, climate change definitely poses huge challenges. But I do think that science has a unique role to play in informing our ability to counter these challenges, and that implies both the way we reduce overgrowth and the consequences of a lack of fires. So ecosystems have changed fundamentally because of relatively few fires in the last few decades. So there's one challenge that we can manage. There's also the challenge of how do we fight these fires? How do we support our firefighters to be able to be ready for the task and also be safe in their own well-being with fires getting faster and more unpredictable? And how do we deal with multiple different fires happening at the same time, which increasingly is a challenge as we're seeing weather extremes and wind conditions that are unusual. So there definitely are many challenges, but I do think our best bet for actually encountering these and actually living up to these is science and a careful thought at these various aspects of the problem.
Hi, my question is about water specifically. As climate change continues and basically demand is going to exceed supply for water, what are some ways that we can correctly, if this is in your area of expertise, what are some ways that we can correctly allocate water to meet residential needs as well as the ecosystem and surrounding environmental needs of those certain communities?
Yeah, I think about this a lot too. When it comes to water, it's difficult because in addition to hydroelectricity, dams also create reservoirs for drinking water, agricultural use, residential homes, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it becomes, once again, kind of like this balancing act. The biggest thing that we need to be doing is making sure that areas that traditionally don't have as much rainfall, for instance, wide swaths of the California desert, we shouldn't be building golf courses or having infrastructure for human enjoyment that requires lots of water, because this will sort of be kind of like a sunk cost almost. So reallocating our resources to provide water where it's needed, but not so much diverting it to areas of the desert in order to basically kind of like distribute those resources in a way that will allow us to use the water for kind of like spread the wealth as much as possible. So that's one place that my mind goes, as well as just being aware of how most of our water consumption is actually from big corporations. And so it feels very powerless when us as individuals, we do what we can to save water. And then, a lot of it may feel like we're only, doing very little. So putting pressure on large corporations, as well as having science that emerges that explains this in order to sort of push legislation and other actions that collectively will allow us to redistribute resources and use water more effectively so that we are not wasting the resources that we use, and we can also basically help the environment and do as much as we can that way as well.
Other questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry if I missed this part, but did you talk about desalination?
I personally don't know much about that, but I study freshwater systems, so I don't know too much about desalination, but I'm curious if anyone else has thoughts or knowledge.
Not in detail. I think the challenge is really one of the cost-benefit ratio. It tends to be very costly. In some areas that is a worthwhile investment, in others it's not. So I think it's just one of the many solutions that is on the table to deal with water issues. For the Bay Area, I think it's been looked at, but I think it was considered to be too costly for where we are right now. But it's definitely an option worth looking into.
So, given our epic rain this past year, what's the latest on trying to capture flood water?
It's a very controversial question. So people have very different opinions on this, and I don't want to take a stand on it. So let me just describe some of the options that are being discussed. There's a group of advocates that argues this is an opportunity to refill our groundwater storage. Groundwater has been depleted very severely, particularly in the Central Valley, has led to a lot of subsidence. So some people say, well, we have all of this water now, why don't we use it to replenish our groundwater? That's hard to do in practice when it rains that day. You kind of need to be ready for that. As for many solutions, you kind of need to think about them in advance. And again, that's why I think the science really shines, is like, let's think about what we want to do with it and then be ready once that moment comes. Another group of advocates would like to store that water, for example, build more dams. There's definitely a group of advocates for more infrastructure, significantly amping up the infrastructure we have in California to deal with rainwater. That includes both building new dams, increasing walls on rivers and other flood protection infrastructure. Again, it's very contentious because of the ecosystem consequences it can have, and also because some communities don't consider it to be aesthetically pleasing or a desirable way to go, and not particularly sustainable, but it is an option that particularly communities with a high risk of being flooded would like to see on the table. Then there are advocates for more nature-based solutions, trying to store that water by creating more of the natural marshland that we had here in the area. Again, that takes a while, and it's not always easy to bring an ecosystem back once it's been destroyed, but it's definitely an option that is being discussed very thoughtfully. So I think there is a lot of options, and we need to think about how we weigh the different benefits and how we, first of all, quantify the different benefits, both to different communities and to different communities along river. Often one community is louder than the other communities along river, but maybe we want to think about everybody here. But also the benefits to ecosystems, to fish, to other to the natural world more broadly. So it's a big debate. I think it's far from over. I think it's just beginning. So I'm curious to see where that will go and what we decide to do. But I think science can inform the different solutions that are on the table.
And I'll just add to that, as someone that thinks about this or has started to think about this more carefully in the past couple years, a lot of us who are currently training as PhD students, master students, emerging scientists are thinking about these things carefully, because we obviously see the infrastructure around us and we have an idea of human need for example, water. And I think a lot of us, at least speaking in the circles that I communicate with, are very consciously trying to design and ask research questions that are considerate of all these different options and all these different ways that we can gain an understanding of what's happening in the environment to choose what's best in this cost-benefit analysis. One of the things we weigh would be environmental impact.
It's time to wrap it up. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And I haven't asked them, but I imagine they are available for further questions if you're interested to engage. And each of you have a poster also, right? Okay. Thanks,
and thank you all for being here. We really enjoyed hearing from you, and thanks for your interest and time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.